laptop.
Yeah. Hi. Hello. Welcome to the Sankofa Pan-African series. I'm going to start by putting it out there, sending out some kind of apology because I'm a novice at this. So if we get into some technical hitches, please forgive me. as we continue the live broadcasts, I'm sure that I'll get better at it. I really want to thank those of you who have supported us through your subscriptions, sharing our videos, and then your really really exciting engagement, at the community on the community platform. We're really grateful to you, and then with your support, we'll keep bringing you this. So I will not want to stretch this too long because I know that people are joining in from various parts of the world, and because of time differences, it might be quite late for some people. So I'll keep it as brief as I can. The topic, as we have agreed on the website, is we want to examine whether or not there was a black presence in the Americas before Columbus. I think we took a poll, and a lot of you indicated your preference for this topic. I think because we had another possible topic that we were going to talk about. So we'll start with the question: did Columbus discover the Americas? And I hope out there we're all answering in a resounding no. Before Columbus set foot in the Americas, the American continent was occupied. In fact, and even going by Columbus's account, we know this. So we can start by even raising this question: that how could the continent have been unoccupied if Columbus wrote about being watched by people the first time he arrived there? There's no question about it. There were people living on that continent way before Columbus's fake discovery of America. However, nowadays, Eurocentric scholars are ready to concede that yes, there were people there. They are just as equally eager to convince us that there were various people from Europe and Asia who had managed to find their way to the Americas before Columbus. They are, however, most reluctant to concede that Africans were there before Columbus, or that Africans were some of the earliest people, to inhabit that continent or to reach that continent, the American continent. So, but there is, however, sufficient evidence to prove that Africans were there before Columbus. So what I'm going to try to do in this presentation is to share some evidence that I've come across in researching this topic. So some of the evidence of African life and culture in the Americas actually go back to Columbus himself, because during Columbus's second voyage, he took spearheads that were made with gold he took spearheads that were made with gold back with him to Europe, to his country. Now they were, and the spearheads he took were similar to the ones used in West Africa. And then it's not just a question of hearsay. He actually recorded how the people who gave him the spearheads in the Americas said they were brought there by dark-skinned people who came there on large boats. In fact, according to historian and linguist Leo Weiner of Harvard University, in his book Africa and the Discovery of America, Columbus recorded in his journal entry that the Native Americans told him that black-skinned people had come from the southeast in boats trading in gold-tipped spears. Now, apart from what Columbus said, the natives told him, the composition of the metals on the spear, the composition used to make those spears, have been examined, and they have been found to be similar in ratio, in terms of the ratio of gold, copper, and silver alloys that were used to make those spears. They're similar to what was used in in West Africa, by the great empires of West Africa. The same ways in which they combined gold, copper, and silver to make their spears, the same ratio of those metals are the same that were found in the spears that Columbus took with him. And the natives did not try in any way to claim that they made them themselves. They told them that they had been given to them by black-skinned people. Well, and you might want to say that knowing how much of a fraud Columbus was, we probably should not take his not rely too much on his words, right? Well, thankfully, other explorers also attest to the presence of Africans in the Americas. Now, one such explorer was Vasco Nunes de Balboa, who reported meeting people that he described as Ethiopians who lived in a well-established village in Panama, in where we now know as Panama. We've also elaborated in one of our previous episodes on Ethiopia, on the way in which generally dark-skinned people were described as Ethiopians, and how the name Ethiopia used to describe dark-skinned people in ancient times. We dealt with that in some previous episodes, because we illustrated this in our episode on Phyllis Wheatley, who was captured as a girl from the Senegambia area of Africa and then sold into slavery in America. She, like others, described herself and other black people in her poems as Ethiopians. And a lot of the Greek historians like Herodotus and so on, who when they first encountered black people, always used to describe them as Ethiopia. I've also recently written an illustrated children's book on the life of this remarkable woman, Phyllis Wheatley, and it will be released on the 30th of this month. So please look out for it for your children. It's important for us to start them early, start engaging them early in our history, in the good works and remarkable examples that our ancestors have left them, so that when they see themselves, so they can see themselves in a more favorable light than the kind of textbooks, the general textbooks that are available, purporting to be teaching world history and so on. Now, another evidence is that a lot of the original place names that Columbus met in the Americas before he started renaming them. He went on a renaming spree. He renamed virtually everywhere he went. But a lot of the original names that those places had have all been traced back, to African languages. So if Africans had never been there, how come certain place names, were African in origin? Also, there's also the presence of plants like the gourd plant, yams, sweet potatoes, which are native to Africa, which were in the Americas before Columbus or slavery. On another hand, uh, narcotics found in some ancient Egyptian sarcophagi by archaeologists have been found to have come from plants which are native to the Americas. So this prompts this should prompt the question: how did these narcotic substances that are native to the Americas get to Egypt, which is in North Africa, if there had not been any interactions between ancient Egyptians and the American continent? It just begs, and it's a question which begs an answer, which these Eurocentric historians who are bent on claiming that Africans did not get there need to provide us answers with. Now, one of such substances has been identified by German toxicologist Svetla Balabanova as erythroxylon. Erythroxylon is one of the chemicals that used to make cocaine, even till now. So, and it is derived from a plant that was only found in South America. Yet it was found in the coffins of ancient Egyptians. So one question that these skeptics usually throw out there is, how did Africans get to the Americas? And it is not a mystery. Questions. So these questions have been raised. As usual, most Eurocentric scholars are willing to admit that Africans are unwilling. They don't want to admit that Africans had seafaring vessels long before Europeans did. However, we have evidence in the form of remains of Nubian potteries with drawings of boats and other seafaring vessels on them. So why would Nubians be drawing ships on their artworks or even on cave walls if they had never seen one? Artists create, from what they have seen. Yes, they add imagination to it, but imagine someone who had no idea what a ship was. Why would they then be drawing it on even domestic things like this Meroitic jug, which is actually presently housed in the Smithsonian? And we have talked extensively about Nubia and its kingdoms, which existed thousands of years before Christ in previous episodes. So please watch out, go and check out our episodes on Nubia if you haven't. And then in more recent times, even if we come down to more recent times, we have the accounts of how Abubakar II, who was Mansa Musa's predecessor as emperor of Mali, Abubakar II kept sending voyagers to go and find the end of the Atlantic Ocean in the 13th century. Most of these sailors did not come back. They did not return to Mali. Abubakar himself finally set sail with hundreds of men in ships carrying gold, which was abundant in Mali, and enough water and food supplies to last about 2 years. He also never returned to Mali. This was like 2 centuries before Columbus first set foot on the. This was like 2 centuries before Columbus even set foot on the American continent. Now now some historians believed that have actually done research to prove that Abubakar's sailors and possibly himself, ended up in the Americas. So it's not and some of these the evidence that they provide is further buttressed by items like that spearhead that we talked about, that Columbus took back with him to Europe in the 15th century. So those spearheads had arrived in the in the in the continent before the before Columbus himself arrived there. So and then I we again we've treated Abubakar's passion for finding the end of the Atlantic Ocean in an episode on Mansa Musa, as well as our more recent episodes on the Bali Empire. And then recently, I have also recently written a children's storybook um, based on the life of Mansa Musa. Um, it introduces this great ruler to our children in a way that they can identify with him. Now, apart from scholars who actually link this Abubakar and his voyagers' journey, sea voyages, people have actually taken the trouble to experiment with the kind of vessels similar to the types that were used by Africans during the era when Abubakar II and other sailors went to sea. And so they built the kind of ships, dugouts. I think mostly they were ships that were dug out from large pieces of wood, but they were large enough to take, many men and their supplies. And so people now traveled from the western coast of Africa towards the Americas in the same, simulating the kind of journey that these people took. And what they found is that the currents, the wind, the direction of the wind was such that could have gotten them, to the Americas. It is also possible that the wind direction coming back was not favorable, was not as favorable, which was probably why most of them ended up settling down in the Americas. So it's we should not be swayed, by arguments that it would have been impossible for people of African descent to reach the Americas. And then we have one of the scholars who has actually studied, who studies ship, is called Julian Whitewright, a maritime archaeologist at the University of Southampton. And he suggests that it is quite easily plausible for um, African ships, to have easily reached the Americas. So next, let's look a bit more at archaeological uh, archaeological evidence. Now, the most contested archaeological finding, which points to the presence of people of African descent in the diaspora, are the Olmec heads. They, they are huge statues, most of which have striking African facial characteristics found throughout Central and South America. Some scholars use them to support the idea that Africans had settled in the Americas long before its fake discovery by Columbus. Some of the Olmec heads stand over 11 feet in height and weigh between 30 to 40 tons. And some depict men wearing headgears similar to those worn by no. You can see some of the heads. Some of them are wearing helmets. Now, these helmets are similar to those. Yeah, even this one are similar to headgears worn in sub-Saharan and Africa. And some of the heads have, look, compare the eyes of this, compare the eyes in this Olmec head to this Ife head. So some of them have features, and then look at how broad his nose is compared to this one. And then the lips, I mean, we've always been derided for the thickness of our lips, the broadness of our nose, our dark skin, and kinky hair. And these are all portrayed in some of the Olmec heads. Now, and of course, scholars have noted that some of the heads bear very striking similarities, which is why I've put these two heads together. So, what the question that some scholars now ask is, if these the people, why would people who have no connection with Africa, have never seen Africans, go to such a lot of trouble to carve out these huge heads depicting, characters with African features? So one of the things that it proves is that not only were Africans present there, but that they were their presence there was a respectable one. They were not seen as inferior to anybody else who was there at the time. If anything, they were revered. You do not build statues, to honor people that you have no respect for. In fact, some scholars go as far as to say that some of these heads might have been built, were built for worship. So why would you worship somebody, who had not contributed anything, or for whom you have no respect? So these are all questions that Eurocentric scholars who are insisting that these heads are not actually depicting Africans. These are some of the questions that they've never been able to provide answers for. And some scholars have noted that the heads bear striking reason. Yeah. Now, the first of these Olmec heads was discovered by this guy, Jose Melgar, in Veracruz in 1862. And when Melgar discovered them, he concluded that there had undoubtedly been blacks in this country. Melgar, who, as we can see from his image, was not black, so he really had nothing to gain by claiming that they were blacks. Um, and it's also said they represented an important black presence in the American continent. He was so convinced that they were Africans that he wrote and published two papers in which he described them as Negro heads. Other scholars like Leo Weiner, our own Ivan Setima, Clyde Hamad Winters, and so many others have also identified some of these heads with sub-Saharan Africa. Now, these claims have not only been based on just interpretation of facial features of some of the statues, but they have pointed to epigraphical, genetic, and osteological evidence to support their claims. Now, using epigraphic evidence, researchers claim that the Mesoamerican writing system, that is the system that was found, the ancient writing systems of the people of the Americas, are related to African scripts. For example, Constantine Samuel, for Constantine Samuel um, actually proposes that Mayan inscriptions were related to Libico Berber writings of Africa. Leo Weiner, who I keep mentioning, also posits that various Olmec symbols are similar to those found in Vai script used in the area that we now know as Liberia. And according to um, Ivan Setima, in 1959, he reports that in 1957, three professors released radiocarbon dating for an Olmec ceremonial center in Mexico. Now, the center, which was situated close to the Atlantic, had four Olmec style stone heads along with wood charcoal, which was dated to about 814 BC. Now, 814 BC, incidentally, coincides with the rise of the Nubian military as a strong force in power politics in Egypt. It was the period during which the Nubians conquered and ruled Egypt. You know, the 25th dynasty. We've dealt elaborately on Nubia's conquest of Egypt in our episode on Nubia. So I keep referring to past episodes because some of these things we're talking about will make better sense, will make more sense if if you acquaint yourself with some of the episodes we have done in the past. So please watch it if you want to find out more about the Nubians. Now, during this period, Nubian pharaohs formed alliances with the Phoenicians to fight against their common enemy, the Assyrians. And also under the supervision of under the supervision and military leadership of Nubian captains, they and the Phoenicians carried out maritime trade, which took them far, far into the Atlantic. It is therefore not impossible that they reached America. Now, I am going to Now, in an article that was published on his work in the Washington Post, Ivan Setima also mentions another scholar, Alexander von Wuthenau, an art historian who studied numerous Negroid portraits in clay, gold, copper from ancient and medieval Central South America. Some of the portraits that von Wuthenau studied reflect men, and I'm going to go back to one of the pictures that I displayed earlier on. So he studied, yeah, this one. He studied uh, Wutheno, studied some of the portraits that von Wutheno studied reflect men with beautifully kinky African hair texture. Some had goatees. These are just a few of them, and then there are, if you look online, there are loads of these tiny versions of the big Olmec heads, tiny figurines, and some of these were studied by Wudeno, and he believed that they show the beautifully kinky African head texture. Some had goatees, and some were wearing African style earrings, headdresses, hairstyles, and facial tattoos and scarifications, found by different African ethnic groups. So, for those who would continue to argue, that the stone heads um, that so for those who will continue to argue that the stone heads of Mexico are not representations of African people, but that they were carved that way for reasons that cannot be explained, they would rather go, they would rather say that the reason why these people carved people with African features cannot be explained than admit that they were carved, either by Africans or by people who lived, with Africans, who knew Africans, who had actually seen Africans, and who were kind of maybe in awe of the way the Africans looked, and then they were, they admired them enough, respected them enough to spend hours, possibly months and years, carving, various figures and statues about them. So for those of them who continue to argue that there was no reason, that they cannot just explain why these people went to so much trouble to carve people who look like Africans, Ivan Shetima has this question to say: how can the small clay figurines found buried side by side with the stone heads be explained? So even if they say, okay, the big ones were definitely not African, what about the small ones, with kinky hair, and then usually made with very expensive materials like gold and so on, and then adorned with earrings? So even if some of the heads were covered by the helmets, the little figurines had kinky hair. So how can all of this be explained? The clay figures found buried with the Olmec heads bear distinctly African, were distinctly African in skin color, hair, and facial structures. So, and so again, in 1974, a Polish, so continuing with genetic studies and osteological evidence, in 1974, a Polish criminologist, Andrzej Wersinski, who, for the avoidance of doubt, was also not black, put forward very convincing evidence that some of the Olmecs were of African origin. He supported his claims by studying some skeletal cranial evidence from two Mesoamerican sites in Mexico. In order to analyze the racial heritage of the skeletons, Wersinski used classic diagnostic traits in order to determine the craniometrics and cranioscopic, qualities of the skeletons he was studying. He also used the Polish Comparative Morphological Studies Skeletal Reference Collection in order to compare them. In other words, what he did was to use these measurements to then compare, three sets of cranial, three cranial sets that he was studying. Now, so some of the sets he was using to compare with the skeletal remains were from Poland, representing what we now know generally as Caucasian, skeletons. Another set were from Mongolia, representing Oriental, and then a third set was from Uganda, representing Negroid. So when he compared the ancient skeletal remains to these three racial categories, he did so in order to find which groups resembled the craniums he was studying. And then based on his comparisons, Wiercinski summarizes that the indigenous rootstock of the areas that he studied had people who had Pacific racial elements, others had Chinese, while others had equatorial and Bushmanoid elements. So there is no doubt that there were more than one group of people who lived at the time, on the American continent, and Africans were definitely a significant portion of them. So naturally, Eurocentric scholars continue to challenge these claims, but let's also look at one or two more evidence that have been uncovered, which prove the presence of Africans in the Americas. Genetic studies and osteological evidence found even in recent times. There are findings which show the presence of Africans in U.S. territories preceding Columbus. One example was reported by a team of researchers from the Smithsonian Institute. A team of scholars from Smithsonian Institute who found two Negro male skeletons in the United States Virgin Islands. Now, the men were believed to have died when they were still in their 30s. Now, the skeletons were found in a grave that had been used and abandoned by native Indians long before the coming of Columbus to the Americas. Now, the soil from the ground in which the skeletons were found was dated to 1250 AD. A study of the men's teeth showed a type of dental mutilation characterized by early African cultures. There are still parts of Africa today where, they kind of shave their teeth, as a form of beautifying themselves. And these are ancient practices that are still carried on in some African communities till today. Now, these kind of mutilations were found on these skeletons that had died 1250 AD, centuries before Columbus set foot in the Americas. And even one of the skeletons was actually holding a clay vessel of pre-Columbian Indian design. Now, the discovery of these skeletons is, of course, not unique, and because there are more, that have been found in various parts of the U.S. According to the discovery of these two skeletons, of course, it's not unique and should not surprise us. And according to the physical anthropologist Ernest Houghton, other crania that closely resemble the crania of Negro groups have been found in pre-Columbian layers in the valley of the Pecos River in northern Mexico and Texas. Now, the Pecos River empties into the Gulf of Mexico. So, even on mainland America, there are evidences that there were people of African descent there before Columbus. Another significant set of archaeological remains that point to an African presence, but which, surprise, surprise, is still highly contested, are the pyramids found at La Venta. Now, these La Venta pyramids bear some striking similarities to the pyramids of Egypt and Nubia. They are said to be positioned on a precise north-south axis, like the African ones. Also, like the African ones, they were built using the same standard of measurements that was utilized by mathematicians of ancient Egypt and Nubia. They also served as tombs and temples, and sometimes as celestial observatory, just exactly the way they were used by Egyptians and Nubians. So I am going to round up this presentation uh, because I'd like to hear from you. Like I said from the onset of this series, I cannot, I am not and cannot claim to be a repository of all the information and knowledge out there about Africans and Africans in the diaspora. Um, and there's absolutely no doubt that there were various groups inhabiting the continent that I have not found out about, and I'm sure that some of you might have contributions to make to further enlighten us about the contributions of our ancestors in that journey. I just want us to always keep challenging anybody out there who tries, to claim that Africans only got to America as slaves. There were waves of them who got there as independent people, and according to Rafik Jairasboy, the black began by the black, it means black people began their career in America not as slaves but as master. And any way we view it, Mexican civilization, North American civilization, I'd like to qualify, American civilization generally had its origin, in Africa. So I'm really anxious to hear from you. Um, okay, I have got a question. A question has just been sent in saying, I think the first question I have here is that, hello? Yes, sorry I lost you there for a minute. But I have a question here from someone. Uh, like I explained at the beginning, I'm still trying to figure out how this works. So excuse me, and as you can see from my gray hair, I'm old school, so I'm not technically savvy. Anyway, I have a question here by Ihuoma, who says, since the earth toned man was the first kind of human? Where did Caucasians come from? Well, I actually think this is one question that has been laid to rest. The truth of the matter is that the first human beings to inhabit this beautiful earth of ours were African. All of the oldest remains, that have been found in Africa, the Olduvai Gorge, in places like Morocco, South Africa, and so on. There's no other remains of ancient people who have been that have been found that have not been of African origin. Now, there are various theories as to how the other races evolved, out of those initial Africans who peopled the earth. One of the theories is that the continents as we know them now, did not always were not always completely separated, and that during, I mean, millions of years ago, that there were some linkages, there were some links between some of the continents, allowing people to move freely from one continent to another, and that some people, and also going by the theory of evolution, you know, different people inhabiting different parts of the world evolved to suit, or where the way they evolved was influenced by the environment in which they found themselves. As such, Europeans, who ended up on a rather cold continent, their skin did not continue to produce melanin at the level which it did when their ancestors first got there, and so Caucasians, whether they like it or not, over all ethnic groups, all racial groups, whether they like it or not, emanate from Africa. They originate, the human race started in Africa. I hope that satisfies your question, Ihoma. Yeah, and yes, so we, which is also why we should know that this idea of segregating people strictly on the basis of race is nonsensical. The human race is one, and the fact that Africans have been, set aside, relegated, almost excluded from the human race. I mean, there were times in history when we were excluded from the human race, when people actually preferred to see us as being more closely related to animals. It's idiotic. It's nonsensical, you know. Okay, I also have another somebody. Have you read a brief? Who is asking if I have read a brief account of the destruction of the Indies by Bartolome de la Casa, and my opinion about the book. Actually, I have not read that book, but I am. This question is by Canada Racing Joy. I am grateful for you bringing it to my attention. I will read it, and then maybe in a future episode, I will let you know my comments about it. But I have not read it, and so I don't feel myself qualified, to answer your question. If there are any of the other you other viewers out there who have read this book by Bartolome de la Casa, please feel free to share your opinion with Canada Racing Joy and myself. I'm very curious now, to look into what this book is about. So I am promising I will read this book, Canada Racing Joy, and then share my opinion in future episodes. I have another question by Akata. what a nickname. Akata says, how many African cultures had written languages? Most, few. Now, it's difficult to determine precisely how many African cultures had written languages, but there are. Egypt, for instance, left clear evidence of their writing. Now, and we've also examined, even when we compare the culture of Egypt and Nubia, which were actually close and who were neighbors, we find that Egypt had a reason, was compelled to evolve writing, was more compelled to evolve writing, at an earlier stage than Nubia. I know that Nubian cultures like Meru eventually also had their own writings. Unfortunately, they've never been translated or deciphered like the Egyptian one. But one of the reasons that historians have given for why Egypt was compelled to evolve writings very early was because the Egypt became a more Egypt became a more, first of all, evolved a more centralized kind of administrative system, especially also because they had to find ways to develop to grow food, using the Nile to irrigate their lands. So they were more compelled, to write because of the system, the system of governance. Whereas Nubia, which shared the same, very similar material cultures as Egypt, they remained small for quite a long time, and so their administration was more decentralized. So that's just one of the reasons given. But in terms of knowing precisely how many African ethnic groups had written languages, it's a study that is still going on. But I must also comment here that question, I hope it is not stemming from a place where writing is being seen as superior to orality, because you will find that even in African cultures that did not develop, written scripts, there were established systems of using oral culture, orature, as extensively as anybody else could have used writing. I mean, actually, my PhD dissertation was on looking at the ways in which orature, that is the whole body of oral culture, not just oral history now, but orature as a whole, worked and could be favorably compared to written cultures in the evolution of knowledge, of philosophy, and so on. The fact that some African cultures did not write, did not mean that they were inferior in terms of the generation and evolution of knowledge. It is only a Eurocentric mindset that would make anybody look down, on an ancient African culture which did not evolve writing when compared to one that involved writing. So yeah, so I hope that question did not come from that type of mindset. I think I have I have another question by Seed Sit There. I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name. Please forgive me. Sit There, who wants to know why the pyramids in Sudan are not as glamorized as the ones in Egypt. Well, I think it's probably because first of all, right from when Europeans started being curious about Africa, ancient civilizations, and so on, because by the time they started studying these things, Egypt a had been invaded by various waves of people who were not necessarily dark skinned. It was easier for them to accept the Egyptian civilization as an important one. Okay, so that's one way of looking at it. So that the interest in Egyptology was so high that, in fact, one can safely say that the study of archaeology in most European um, universities was born or was developed on the back of studying Egypt. So there was such a lot of interest in the study of everything Egypt at one time. And so the pyramids in Egypt, of course, were, were more easily studied, more readily studied, and a lot more written about them. And so even when so it was later that they now started looking at areas like Sudan and so on, and what they did not realize is that Egypt, or what they were not ready to concede, which might also have explained why the pyramids in Sudan and all the other developments that took place outside Egypt, we did not want to consider them as important, had to do with the fact that Nubia has always been perceived to be a civilization of people of dark skin. And whereas we know now, from extensive studies carried out by people like J. Kanta Diop and so on, and even who are now unearthing even what ancient Greek historians who actually saw, Egyptians recorded centuries ago, that it, and also from the steles, evidence left, in stone by ancient Egyptians themselves, the original inhabitants of Egypt were actually from places like this, like which later became Nubia and so on. So places like the Sudan, Somalia, and so on. So they were dark-skinned people. So this ignorance, and then this racist mindset, because no matter how highly educated people are, we are often still handicapped to our racial, to some kind of mindset, which might be informed by our racial bias. So that, I think, is one of the reasons why, it's also possible to be one of the reasons why the pyramids in Sudan have not been as celebrated as the ones found in Egypt. I hope that answers your questions. But they were not by any means or in any way, inferior to the ones found in Egypt. Well, if I have no more questions, I think I'm going to round up this session by thanking those of you who turned up. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you very much. I It's no use, going to all this trouble, carrying out all this research, if I don't get your comments and if you and your reactions, which you have been very, very generous with, and I can assure you we're listening, and we're being directed, by the questions and the comments that you send to us. We will try and make this a more regular thing if you indicate interest in it, So, and don't forget, please, if you have not subscribed to Sankofa Pan African series, please do so. And then please, we're going to put this up. So please share this with your friends. And then let's have more of your comments and questions, which we'll endeavor to answer. Someone is asking when our next live session will be. I think we're going to leave that to you. We're going to decide that when we hear your comments, and then we'll and just like we collectively decided the topic that we discussed today, we also want to hear from you. You know, the topic you want us to do next. Anyway, enjoy the rest of your day, and until next time, bye.